thank you for having us. My name is Noreen Lucey, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Matt Tips. So, no, Noreen, myself and Matt, we volunteer with an organisation called CANI, the Climate Action Network for International Educators. We're a voluntary organisation, so we work in the field of international education and higher education, and it's really a network to share, I suppose, resources, best practices, learnings in terms of the work that we're doing in emissions reductions. We have various working groups, and we're always looking for, I suppose, fresh faces to join the network. So if anyone's interested in, I suppose, just taking a look at what we're doing and maybe joining some of the working groups in terms of what might be applicable to what you're trying to achieve at your institution or organisation at the moment, we would love to welcome you. Been through, I suppose, the voluntary work that we've done, that we have built up this knowledge that we're very happy to share with you today. So I'll take a quick look at, I suppose, the agenda for today. So I suppose it's really to, I suppose, ground ourselves in why we're giving up our Friday afternoon to meet here. And it's, I suppose, looking at the impact areas in catering to, I suppose, look at how this applies to all of us in our different roles in different institutions and organizations. But it's really to start understanding the impact of food production and consumption and the emissions related to that. To, I suppose, define what is sustainable catering, to look at a few examples of sustainable catering, and maybe to hear from yourselves in terms of what you think sustainable catering is, and to learn from you also. We'll try and start building a sustainable catering toolkit and have a practical element to the presentation as well. And maybe, you know, have you go away today with the start of an action plan. We'll look at some case studies, and we'll also share tips and resources. And I know that these will also be sent out along with the presentation. So don't worry if you miss anything, we'll make all of that available to you. But I suppose before we get started, I suppose, you know, as Chris mentioned about the climate and nature crisis, you know, it is very real. It's impacting all of us. It's in our professional and personal lives. And I suppose something that I heard recently was that, oh, I'm going to get this wrong. It's the next big thing is a number of small things. And I think sometimes we just have to, you know, maybe acknowledge that, you know, we're here, we're gathered here as a group. And, you know, maybe from this and from this meeting, we'll take away some small actions, and I suppose all together they'll build into a bigger action. So it's very important that we acknowledge that our time here today is of value. But I suppose to look at what is causing the climate and nature crisis, we're just not living sustainably. And that is in terms of, you know, our consumption of stuff, our consumption of food, and how we're producing that food is just not sustainable. And considering that the world population has more than tripled in the past 70 years, it's gone from 2.5 billion in 1951 to more than 8 billion now, and increasing. We really need to tackle the fact that we're just not living sustainably. This image was shared with me by a colleague because in 2020, the mass of man-made stuff which we're consuming, it surpassed that of global living biomass, so animals and plants and nature. You know, and I find this quite unsettling, you know, because we are accumulating, and it just seems that we can't get enough of stuff. So it's really about our consumption. But then I suppose, you know, relating that back to food, we really need to look at how we are producing food and consuming food. And we'll look at some shocking figures on food waste later. But just, I suppose, to ground us in the here and now as well, and the problems that we are facing. I suppose what I'd like to do is maybe just have that mindset shift in terms of, you know, food and drink, and what are the impact areas of, you know, our catering, or the catering of that of our suppliers. If we look at energy, I suppose it's understanding the energy that goes into food preparation. Where is that energy coming from? It's understanding how are we measuring that energy? Is that coming from renewable energy? Like, do we know the emissions that are coming from the food that we are serving? Do we know our electricity suppliers? What energy mix is made up of renewables? It's just getting us to think more about the amount of energy that goes into this impact area. Transport, do we know where our food is coming from? Is it locally sourced? What are the food miles? Are we dependent on food that's being flown in from, you know, California, Mexico? Like, do we really think about where is our food coming from? Waste to resources, we'll touch on food waste, but how can we eliminate food waste? And if we can't eliminate food waste, then where is it going? Do we really know where our food waste is going? And is food waste being, you know, turned into a very precious resource like compost or digestate or biogas? So it's really looking at the whole life cycle of food in terms of production, preparation, consumption, and waste. And again, nature. Do we really understand where the food is coming from? I suppose how it's being produced, you know, in terms of, is it regenerative agriculture or is it intensive agriculture and soil depletion? You know, I suppose understanding the environment of where our food is coming from, and are they respecting biodiversity? So really understanding that life cycle again is so important. Water, the water used in the production of food. Again, do we understand the food types? And like, I kind of also always try and think like how much water goes into producing a certain amount of food. And it's really interesting to look at these resources online where you can see, you know, how many liters of water goes into growing almonds, or, for example. And I use that example because I suppose the Californian drought, a lot of that has been linked to the monoculture and the overproduction of almonds, which, you know, require an awful lot of water. So it's making food choices in relation to all of these impact areas. And then governance, I suppose it's understanding, you know, who are our stakeholders, who are our suppliers, who are our audiences, and really trying to frame that conversation to include everybody in, you know, our catering choices and conversations. I suppose as well, it's on continuation of the impact areas. It's understanding, I suppose, where I suppose does food production, but you know, I suppose sustainable catering fit into in terms of emissions. How do we measure those emissions? And I suppose within your organization or your school or your institution, you know, you'll have your scope 1 emissions, which will be easy to measure. That'll be everything that's on site, you know, at your school or your building. Moving into scope 2, again, that would be relatively straightforward to measure because that would be the electricity that you're using, your electricity supplier to power everything. But your scope 3 are more difficult, and food lies within the scope 3 emissions. So I suppose it's challenging, but I think we have to start somewhere. And I think starting to understand, well, how do I measure the emissions from the food that we're using, either directly or indirectly? It's a start. And I think today might be, you know, a good time to ask those questions. Some people might already be on that journey and might have already started to do that. But it's certainly, I suppose, when we can measure the emissions coming from food, then we can tackle that and set targets. But really, I suppose, let's ask ourselves, like, what is sustainable catering? And, you know, it can mean different things to different people. But I suppose maybe at a broad and maybe simple level, it's about communicating, you know, the food choices through our catering. So I suppose if you're a school offering meals, if you're working with an accommodation provider, or if, you know, you're organizing a conference, it's the communications around why you're making the food choices that you're making. So that's really, really important because it can be a controversial topic. You know, everyone has their own views on this, so it can be quite controversial, but it's very important to communicate this. I think it's about careful resource management of where your food is sourced, and it's knowing where your food is sourced. It's going right back down the value chain, and, you know, that's easy to manage when it's you that's doing the catering, but when it's a catering company or a supplier, or you're attending a conference where there's food being served, it's more difficult to understand where the food is being sourced, but it's something we have to become more aware of. It's reducing the impacts and the emissions and choosing local suppliers. It's, I suppose, being more conscious of the food miles and the transport involved in sourcing that food. It's really about understanding the emissions and then being able to make the right choices. But it's also leading by example. And I suppose it's so important to gather in conversations like this, because we can't do it alone. Like, no school can do this alone. We have to talk to our partners, our suppliers, and really understand the influence that we have in those conversations. And ultimately, why we're here today is about creating positive change. I think I've mentioned influence a few times. I think that if we understand what influence we have over this or what we don't have over this, it helps as well. And I think this kind of breaks down the level of influence we can have. Like, that outer circle is, we don't have a direct influence over, I suppose, these stakeholders, but there's definitely that behavioral change which we can bring about. And I kind of use the example of, audiences, if it's an event, or students, if it's in schools, to, I suppose, starting that behavioral change. And when people see different types of menus, it's just in their conscience, and exposing them to different food choices. I suppose the inner circle is we have more control. And that would be with our suppliers, with our partners. It's maybe asking food suppliers or engaging with them in terms of, what are you doing to introduce more sustainable food choices? So there's, we're increasing the influence we have. And it's really about the dialogue with our partners or with our partner institutions, saying, oh, what are you doing? And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to, I suppose, measure food emissions, but bring about more actions. And it's really all of these conversations. We can provide best behavior, or we can learn from others. But the inner circle is what you have direct control over, and that starts with your team. So I suppose it's from today, next week, can you, include it in the team meetings, or bring it to leadership and say, look, we'd really like to tackle or understand food emissions, and really, I suppose, start to set out a policy on that. And that's really what you have direct control over. So sometimes you have to start with what you have direct control over and then work your way out. So it's certainly a journey. But of course, then it kind of depends on, I suppose, our role and, where we sit within an organization or a school or an institution. But sustainable catering, it can apply to, I suppose, our internal events and then the external events. So, it might be the conferences and training days that we attend. It might be workshops and networking events we attend. And we won't have a direct influence on that, but we can become more aware of what that conference is doing, and I suppose, inquire about, what are you doing to provide more sustainable catering. It can be, what we're directly doing, catering at residential schools, student cookery workshops. It can be our partnerships with accommodation providers. Directly, what are we providing for staff meals and away days? So I suppose, everyone here today will have a different role and they will have different responsibilities. But I think that we will all be affected by one of these, and whether it's directly within our control and something we can do something about, or if it's that influence and our engagement with external partners, then, we can certainly start somewhere and frame this within these internal and external, I suppose, engagements. And then, of course, outside of our professional work, it's everything, isn't it? It's like weddings, festivals, sports, events. It's really being conscious of, okay, what food is on offer? Where does that come from? It's really getting into that mindset of thinking about this. And then once you get into that, then you'll wish you never had, because everything you see or go to, it's you'll be, torturing yourself in terms of, oh, I wonder what the food miles is for that. I know I do as well. So you mightn't want to delve too much into that sometimes. But it's the mindset shift, isn't it? And I suppose that's for everything. But I suppose understanding then food and drink as an impact area, I suppose this is very sobering in terms of the impact that food has. But I would say that our current system of producing food has. I think it's very important to frame that because it is a major driver of climate change. It's leading to land use change, biodiversity loss, depletion of freshwater resources, pollution of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. 1/3 of all our food produced globally is wasted, and food waste accounts for about 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's the current system, it's the way we're producing food that's just not sustainable. And if you think that 1/3 of all food produced globally is wasted, that's unethical, it's criminal, and we really need to do more about that at every level. It's in our kitchens at home, it's in, I suppose, the workplace. It's we all have a responsibility, not to forget that statistic, because it should not be happening. So it's I suppose that's why we're here, to understand more about how we can reduce food waste and really understand the impact that food has on our overall emissions. I think this is helpful. Sometimes I suppose it's quite a complex subject, isn't it? That there's a lot to take in with this, but I think, if we gradually, I suppose, start to understand where the food is coming from, how different foods have different emissions. I know that, most people will be aware that, I suppose, beef, has a very high emissions per kilogram. But did we know that chocolate and coffee are up there? That's quite sobering, given my dependency on chocolate and coffee. But it's that understanding of the emissions of different types of food. So there's a lot to take in, but I suppose it's a good place to start is the sourcing, and I think I've mentioned it a few times, but it's really so important to understand where our food is coming from, and to try and to choose local, and to choose what food is seasonal, and not only that, but also, I suppose, go a further level and request organic and fair trade food and beverage providers where possible. At least the coffees and the teas, they mightn't be coming locally, but request that they are fair trade at least. But choosing local and seasonal is also supporting the local economy. It means less food miles, and it has a less environmental and climatic impact. I think when it comes to kitchenware and food packaging, it's a huge culprit. Food packaging is leading to a lot of, I suppose, the generation of plastic. So where possible, if it's directly, I suppose, our role to do this, or indirectly with our suppliers, always request that the packaging is reusable, and then if not, at very least compostable, biodegradable or recyclable. But really reduction is the best thing really there, because there's a lot of plastic out there, so we don't want to be adding to that. Choosing caterers or suppliers that will comply with your objectives. So I suppose if you do have a food policy or a food statement, or if it's included in your sustainability strategy, then share that with caterers and suppliers and say, this is what we want to achieve. We're trying to choose more local, more seasonal. We're trying to reduce the food miles. We're trying to choose responsible kitchenware and packaging, and provide the correct waste management system for our food. Like, communicate that with your caterers and suppliers, because I suppose, I would imagine that we're very dependent on working with caterers and suppliers, but we have to communicate with them, and that's why it's very important to have a statement on your food policy, I think. I suppose a little bit on food waste and the circular economy, and this can be applied to food production, food consumption, and food waste. I suppose, we often hear farm to fork, and the closer we access our food, the better. But it's really that applying that circular economy to food production in terms of, regenerative agriculture. I suppose it's keeping food in circulation, keeping the food waste in circulation to produce very important byproducts. So it's good to think circular anyway, because our current system is so based on that linear economy of take, make, use, and waste. And the recycling economy, I think we've all, it just seems to be the narrative that, oh, recycle more, that's what you do. And even, I have friends and family that say, oh, what should I do? I recycle. And I'm like, yeah, okay, but maybe you should reduce or keep things in circularity, because, recycling is only part of the solution. We have to prevent and reuse first. And I think I saw a statistic that there's between 75 and 199 million tons of plastic currently in our oceans. So I don't think recycling is going to solve that problem. But if we get into this circular mindset, we're going to naturally try and reduce the food waste, and make sure that, it's being, if we do have food waste, it's being made into compost or digestate, or we know where it's going, so that it is being made into very important resources. But I suppose on food waste, the hierarchy here is, and it's the same for any, I suppose, materials. We try to avoid food waste as a start. We really do, and there's a lot of ways that we can do that. And I suppose if we were to go through everything here today, we'd be here for a week. But I suppose it's just these simple nudges in terms of that waste food hierarchy. If we do have food left over, there's a lot of apps out there now, like Olio and Too Good To Go, and all of these tools that help us connect with people, to pass on our leftover food. After that, if the food can't be used by people, then it's can it be used to feed animals. A lot of food waste is now going to anaerobic digestion, which is converting it to a very valuable digestate to go back on the land, or biogas. Composting, of course, can be done locally. And at the very, very last, we say that, it should be disposed of. Like any waste hierarchy, that's the last option, really. So I suppose what I wanted to do, kind of as we kind of lead into more practical side of things, is just provide a few examples, or maybe a few case studies in terms of what other institutions or organizations have done. I like this one. This is from LSE, London School of Economics, and it's showing what they've done. So of course they've gone to look for food welfare standards. They brought in a single-use levy to discourage people, to encourage them to bring their own bottles and cups. Promoting plant-based choices using behavior change science, and that's kind of that outer influence I was talking about. Like if we repeatedly put this food on offer, then that's really creating behavioral change. And food waste, they've addressed that, and using more plant-based food, and then working with these food apps like Too Good To Go, and they have their own system as well called Food Cycle. So there's a lot of support there in terms of how we I suppose use the leftovers. So that was a lovely snapshot, I thought, in terms of what they're doing. This is a really good one too. It's a 15-step, I suppose, guide, and I won't go through them all now because I'm conscious of time. But I love these infographics, and of course, the sources we'll include in the resources document that we'll send. But these are just brilliant, And again, it's communication. Look how they've communicated what they're doing in 15 steps. It's just brilliant, and they cover everything from the food sources, from the kitchenware they're using, the composting. So it's really a lovely example of how they're communicating what they've done in a kind of 15-step plan. This is another one. This is a US institute, and they've kind of like made out the steps that they've taken from 2004 to 2020. Now I think that it's I suppose when we're starting at a baseline, then we will probably try to incorporate these quicker into our food sustainability strategy, but just another really nice example of how they're communicating what they've done. And that's important too. You have to communicate what you're doing as well to our stakeholders. But I suppose just to maybe summarize maybe, or to get us thinking and to kind of get into that action plan, what can we do as catering managers, or what can we do when we're speaking to catering managers if, we're not directly involved? It's very important to understand our food waste and the emissions. Governance and communications is critical. It's very important to communicate what we're doing to our stakeholders so that we get the buy-in from our audience, our students, our partners. If we're working indirectly with suppliers, it's requesting information from them. It's saying, okay, what are you doing? This is what we're trying to achieve. How can we work with you in terms of reducing our emissions by, sourcing more local food, less meat, etc. And those are all of our stakeholders. So it's very important that we get that buy-in so that there's no resistance to what we're doing. Once we understand our emissions, then we're setting targets for annual food waste reductions. And I suppose, this is all part of your food policy or strategy, and it's just communicate. Always tell all of your stakeholders what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve. I suppose I think you can build on your toolkit and checklist. I suppose we've just included as much as we could think of, but it's no means that, like, it's not it's a list that you can add to all the time. And it's really, I suppose, a summary of what I've spoken about, and Matt will explain how they put a lot of this into practice. But it's really, starting with your policy. It's understanding who your partners are. It's speaking with them. Again, looking at the local providers. It's understanding, what your providers are doing. It is then, really ensuring that you are changing the food choices and being more sustainable. It's measuring the food waste. And then it is, I suppose, looking at decreasing, setting targets in terms of your food waste. But it's really, again, I suppose, it's that checklist of how you can put those actions into practice. And then if you do have a sustainable catering policy, just in terms of creating the policy and the strategy and communications, just, I suppose, some top line headings there, really. But again, I know we're kind of covering a lot in a short space of time, but we will send out the resources, and it's just to get you thinking about, next steps and what you might do. But I will be conscious of time, and there will be resources sent out, and we can add to those. But again, it's not climate change, it's everything change. Margaret Atwood said that. I won't take credit for that. And then all small actions lead to bigger actions. And look, here we are today. So I think, if there's a few small actions out of today, then, we've done well. So that's my piece, and I will introduce you to my colleague Matt, and I will manage the slides.
Thank you, Noreen. Always, even for me, always very interesting to get new information. So I hope I can get the slides as well afterwards. So good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in Europe. So my name is Matt Tips. We will take questions together afterwards. I work at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And besides, as Noreen, being a volunteer at the Kenny network, I'm also a board member of another European network. It's Eroica. It's a European network of international relations officers. And actually, we work in life science universities all over Europe. Besides all the information you got from Noreen, I really would like to just give you like a good practice. How is our organization dealing with sustainable catering? So as a good practice, and then we open the floor for discussion. So Noreen, if you can go to the next slide. So yeah, very, very short. It's just so that you know, we are a European network. We have around 200 members, but we come from out of 82 institutions all over Europe. And what we do for our network, we have 2 online webinars, but we also have 1 physical training or conference where our members gather. We are then around 100 people gathering. And of course, this has a certain impact. Next slide, please. So here you can see where our members are coming from. It's all over Europe. So the training always takes place for where it's reachable, but of course, it's going to be all over Europe. And then, of course, we have an impact with that. And that's where our sustainable goals are coming from. So next slide, please. So actually, we work at a university, we work in education, we work in life sciences. So actually, we feel, yeah, we need to lead by example. We need to walk the talk. And we have seen that, of course, these conferences has an impact. We have been discussing with the board, maybe we can do every conference or training completely online. But I think we all know that there is a lot of added value, sometimes really meeting physically. And if you meet with all the colleagues all over Europe once together, once per year in one place, it also avoids a lot of bilateral meetings and visits. So that's why we said, okay, we're going to offer one training or conference per year physically, but let's try to do it as sustainable as possible. So since 2019, this policy now has been in place. Next slide, please. So what do we do? I will highlight some of the topics, and of course, I will dive into the topic of today, the catering, which I will highlight most. But of course, for us, maybe for schools, it's differently, but of course, participants in a conference or training, they need to get there. What we do, of course, is really promoting to our participants to get there in a sustainable way. We know it's not always easy. There are 100 apps to fly somewhere. It's not always easy, even in Europe, to get to the other side of Europe by train or bus. So that's why we really motivate our participants also by communicating and helping them on the websites, in the newsletters, on socials. We really help them and motivate them to come by train. We know it's not always possible, so that's why we do offsetting. We work there together with Tricological, a Belgium-based company where some of our professors are working in. We know there is a big debate about offsetting, but we want to at least try to make it as carbon neutral as possible. Next slide, please. But then, of course, we have the operation. Everybody gathers there, and then there is a lot of operation that comes in place with when you manage a school, when you manage a conference, a training, a festival. And there we really had a look to every single thing. And out of that came, okay, we are not going to offer goodie bags anymore. I think everybody has thousands of these bags, and actually they also have a lot of impact. We don't give printouts anymore. Everybody has a computer or a cell phone. We have a waste sorting mechanism in place. And then, of course, it comes to the topic of the catering. We gather there for 3 to 5 days, so a lot of food being served there for many people. So we do have a big impact. So that you've seen a lot of things in Noreen's presentations, and we really try to highlight many of these things to make it as sustainable as possible for our participants. Next slide. So what we started with and what we still do after a couple of years, of course, we work with reusables, which is a non-brainer, I think. And as Noreen mentioned, there are different ways to put sustainable food. One can be local and seasonal food or having a certain label. We put much attention as well to the plant-based dishes, the vegetarian or vegan dishes. As you've seen in the slide of Noreen, they really have a huge impact. So actually the biggest impact might be there. So that's why we started to offer vegetarian plant-based lunches. And then we increased also to the dinners that I come later on. And then, as you've seen in the triangle of Noreen as well, our leftovers are going to charity. Of course, we try to limit food waste by having very clear numbers of who's participating, who's joining which lunch, who's going to which dinner, so we know exactly how many people will be there. But even then, there might be some leftovers. And therefore, since the last years, we work with local charity projects where we donate the leftovers of the food. Next slide, please. So why do we do it? This is being mentioned by Noreen as well, mainly, of course, because it's not good for the planet. A lot of too much animal production, too much animal protein production, but also, which we might not forget, it's that too much animal production or fish production or intake is not healthy. If you look to the recommendations nowadays from the World Health Organization, they give as a maximum of 35 grams of processed meat per week, only 35 grams. And as well as maximum one-time fish per week. So you really see that even the World Health Organization is putting very strict standards. And so besides that it's not good for the planet, we also know that for our participants, it's even healthier if we proceed with this. Also, as mentioned, as an educational institution, a university, we feel that we need to take the lead. We have a responsibility in this. Also, there comes more and more social pressure. A lot of participants, students are asking us to do so. There is a price setting. Initially, a lot of meat replacers were quite expensive. Nowadays, prices are really dropping. And if you look to beans and cereals, they really are much cheaper compared to meat and fish. So that might be a reason as well. And then we see more and more governments put policies in place as well. So a lot of reasons that can support you to go to a more sustainable catering. Next slide, please. Of course, it might be a bit overwhelming and all these possibilities, or you might start very enthusiastic. But how do you do it? I think it's very important that we start looking to mainly to protein on the plates and the menus. And there it's very important, like try to go to more protein diversity on the menu. It's not only about meat and fish, but include the beans, include meat replacer, include soya. So there are a lot of possibilities to have more diversity on the menu. And there, the next point, which is very important, I think it's good to start slow. It's mentioned in the beginning already, there might be some resistance against this because diet and food seems to be very sensitive. So that's why sometimes it might be a recommendation to start slow. Like we did in our organization, we really started, okay, let's just start with the lunch. So we only offered the lunch as a vegetarian option. And dinner in the evenings, the participants could still choose, but the 3 lunches were vegetarian. So actually, that was going quite easily, so people got used to it. So that was went very well. Or another idea would be that if you have a menu, maybe you can take 60% vegetarian or plant-based and 40% traditional in between brackets. So that's also a start slow so that people can get used to it. Also, you can do some mixes. If, for example, if you make a pasta with minced meat, maybe you can do 50% of real minced meat and 50% of a meat replacer. The flavors are not going to change, but you have a huge impact. Or food swaps, that you change something that is meat that looks like meat. It can be helpful for people to get used to it. Also very easy, if you use cream, use plant-based creams, the flavor is the same, or for your broth, use vegetable broth. So actually slow things that can really have an impact. And then also what can be helpful if you have a buffet, use the animal proteins as side extras. For example, if you have a pasta pesto and you make it plant-based, and then you put some extras like sun-dried tomatoes, but also then maybe some bacon or chicken that people can add, and that they only add what they really need. And maybe a lot of people will not take it, but then it's not feeling offending because it's still there. So these are like some suggestions that we also implemented to start slow. Then the next step that we did for our dinners was actually to make the default option plant-based. Like if for registration forms, we indicated the dinners are plant-based. If you have would you like to have a meat or fish, or you have other restrictions, let us know. So, but the default is plant-based. This way, again, nobody can be against it, and people just click, 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 and they have the default option, but nobody is against it. So that's another thing how we are proceeding. And the last thing is naming, and you will get the slides afterwards. I think came out a new study, a scientific study, and which is like in your menu, not using vegan, vegetarian, or plant-based. It seems very sensitive, very political, and it's actually better like use other words like sustainable or healthy. And that's also, if you put on the menu a vegan lasagna, only a very specific people will take it. But if you put, oh, this is the healthy winter vegetables lasagna, a lot of people will choose for it. And my brother has a catering company. They do exactly these things, and they notice it has a huge effect. So you can find the link to it as well. And it's a very easy way. So you can see, you can really start slow like we did, and then you can slowly increase with some of these tips. So that was for the catering. And just to end, of course, as Noreen mentioned, there are a lot of books that can help you with checklists that can help you. For the last event that we organized in Austria, we received the Austrian label. So they had a checklist with all the things that we needed to be in line with. So that was helpful for us. But also we showed our participants, hey, look, we have the Austrian label. And we are now also working on a checklist like the one that Noreen presented, that we can give for, okay, for every training from now on, this we need to be in line with. And last but not least, it's been mentioned as well, maybe for the next slide, Noreen. Yeah, that I forgot, maybe it was a bit evident as well. Also, besides what you can do as an organizer, of course, the participants, the students, they can do a lot as well. And we help them by giving it's just a one-pager document online. Okay, we will do our best, but maybe you as a participant, you can also considering contributing us to achieving our goal to be a more sustainable conference or training. So we provided that as well. And then I'll come to the last one, and that's actually communication. Noreen said it also many, many times. Communicate what you are doing and also why you are doing this. Like not put like we make vegetarian lunches, but really like explain and why is it is important, give scientific numbers, be gentle and mild to each other. We know in the beginning it might feel a bit out of the comfort zone, but always don't polarize. We are not going to help each other if we really like stay in each other and black and white, really try to find each other, and communication is key in this. So this was my last slide. And as Noreen, on the slide, the next last slide, I also added some resources, and you can contact me as well, but I'm sure the slides will be presented afterwards. So thank you very much.